Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly break from reality to think about what warfare was like hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. And of course, what we do here is we get questions from you, listeners, viewers, readers, and we attempt to answer them. So obviously, some questions are too big or too small. I say that because this question that I'm going to answer now is perhaps one of the former, too big to answer in 10 minutes. We'll see how we go. As a clue, I might answer it in 9 minutes. Oh, that might tell you what it's about. Anyway, you, of course, can ask us a question. You can send us a postcard. You can send us an email. You can comment on one of the previous videos or podcasts. And, of course, you can back us on Patreon if you want. You don't have to, of course, but you can back us at one of three levels: Legionary, Optio, and Centurion. Even get a copy of Ancient Warfare magazine. Right. Now, today's question is from John. As I say, it is a biggie, so hopefully I can do it justice in the 8 minutes I have left. What happened to the Ninth Legion? Righty-ho. Gosh. Now, my view on this is perhaps controversial and maybe not what you've heard before. So, and in fact, I'm going to tack on something else. The reason for that, of course, is famously and probably down to Rosemary Sutcliffe's The Legion of the Ninth, the Lost Ninth Legion, is the idea that after 108 AD is the last piece of evidence we have of the Ninth Legion in York, Iberacum, in ancient Roman Britain. Now, there's several other bits of evidence which seem to suggest that, in fact, we know that the Legion goes to Nijmegen after that, but it disappears from our sources. There's actually another legion, the 22nd Deiotariana, that also disappears in the 2nd century AD, and that's another one of these lost legions. Now, we don't know when they were lost. The most common argument is that the Ninth Legion is lost in a revolt in Britain under Hadrian in around 119 AD, and that the 22nd is lost again under Hadrian in the Jewish revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt of the 130s. There's problems with that because the evidence that tells us that there were great losses to the Romans is very vague, and glaringly obvious is another scenario which tells us that a legion was lost, but no one seems to want to say that the 9th or the 22nd was lost in this particular context. And that context is the Parthian War of Lucius Verus. Now, the Parthian War of Lucius Verus was fought between 162 and 166 AD. It isn't given a lot of attention because we don't have a continuous narrative, and we rely on some quite disparate sources, the Scriptores Historiae Augustae, or the SHA, the letters of Marcus Cornelius Fronto, and several works of the satirist Lucian of Samosata, as well as some very small and short fragments of Dio Cassius. Now, that war hasn't really been given much attention, but it's the precursor to that war, what the Parthian king Vologases did in 161, which is important, and we'll get to that in a minute. So I think that the Parthian War should be paid a lot more attention to because it gives us the best clue to the great mystery of the Roman Imperial army, what happened to the Ninth Legion. And in fact, I think it tells us what happened to both lost legions, but we'll get to that. Now, jumping backwards, the Parthian War of Lucius Verus is the breaking of an uneasy peace, which had endured since Trajan's campaign in 117 AD. War had threatened at various times in the interim, but hasn't broken out. So there's a threat that war might break out under Hadrian. Seems to have suffered many threats to his imperial peace. And in 123, Hadrian tours to the east, and that seems to quiet things down. He also dispatches a force of 2 legions, the 2nd Traiana and 3 Cyrenica, which basically restores peace in the east. It almost breaks out again under Antoninus Pius, but according to the SHA, Antoninus Pius writes a letter to the army, to the Parthian king, and that basically stops any plans of a war. There's also some buildup of troops in Syria, we're told. So that's what happens. However, when Antoninus Pius dies in March 161, and when Lucius Verus and Marcus Aurelius become emperors, brother emperors, the war does break out, and Vologases does invade Armenia in 161, sort of almost as soon as the change of emperor occurs, which implies that it had been planned for some time. The Parthians expel the Roman client king of Armenia, Sohomaeus, and Vologases installs his son as the king of Armenia, Bakur, later called Pacorus. Now, what happens is the governor of Cappadocia, Marcus Sedatius Severianus, invades Armenia with an insufficient force, and he is annihilated and takes his own life at Alagaia, which is a place we don't know exactly where it is, and we haven't found it, which might answer all of the stuff that I'm about to suggest. Now, we don't know which legion Severianus took with him into Armenia. It may have been the 9th, and it may have been the 22nd, either or it may have been both. Now, the reason I say that is that the garrison of Cappadocia was 2 legions, and it seems very odd that a governor responding to an invasion of Armenia would take only half of his garrison. I think he would take all of his forces, and there's a reason for that. I'll get to it. And so he invades Armenia and is captured at Alagaia just over the Euphrates, is destroyed, and then retreats to the city where he takes his life. And the city story. It's a little bit unclear because the sources are so bad, whether the annihilation happens first, then he retreats to the city and takes his life, or whether he's defeated, retreats to the city and takes his life, and then the annihilation happens. I think the annihilation first makes more sense for why he would choose to take his own life. So anyway, that's that. Vespasian had made Cappadocia into an imperial proconsular province, meaning that it got a double legion garrison. Prior to that, it was a procurator's province. Now, there are enough gaps in what we know of the legions and their movements. Later, Cappadocia has the 12th and the 15th Legion stationed there. But throughout this period, and especially in the wars of Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, there's a lot of shuffling of legions about between camps and between provinces. And there's enough gaps in our knowledge to say that perhaps both those 2 legions were in fact transferred to Cappadocia, lost, and then replaced. But more of that anon. As I say, the last record we have of Hispana is in York in 108, and Deiotariana is last attested at Nicopolis in Egypt in 119. What we have, however, is some other evidence which suggests that this idea that they're lost under Hadrian is a little bit premature. So we have an inscription which is hard to date. It's sometimes dated to the reign of Antoninus Pius, sometimes it's dated to 165 AD. And Duncan Campbell dates it to just before 165, and I agree with him, for the reason that this inscription lists all of the Roman legions geographically from east to west, and the 9th and the 22nd are missing from that list. And at the bottom of that inscription are the 2 new legions raised by Marcus Aurelius, the 2nd and 3rd Italica. They're added at the bottom out of order. And so that list is regarded as saying, well, this is a list of all the legions available, and because the last 2 are out of order, that's a later edition, but I think it might be not that far wrong. So it's often argued that the 2 lost legions were lost in the revolts in Britain and the Jewish revolt, as I mentioned, but the evidence for that is not very good at all. And the evidence that we've got for both the revolt in Britain and in Judea isn't enough to support a catastrophe. For instance, we've got the SHA having a vague statement and a letter of Frontos and a passage in Dio. So the SHA, in its Life of Hadrian, says, the nations that Trajan had subjugated were defecting, the Moors were attacking, the Sarmatians were making war, the Britons could not be kept under Roman control. That's it. Marcus Cornelius Fronto says in a letter to Marcus Aurelius written in 162, so sometime later, under the rule of your grandfather Hadrian, what a number of soldiers were slain by the Jews, what a number by the Britons. Again, not catastrophic, just there were losses. Then Dio records that all of Judea rose up, and many outside nations too were joining them through eagerness for gain, and the whole earth, one might say, was being stirred up over the matter. Again, not particularly bad. Hadrian sent against the Jews his best general, Julius Severus, and Severus didn't risk open battle but intercepted small groups and so was able to crush, exhaust, and exterminate them. Very few of them, in fact, survived. Dio emphasizes the losses not of the Romans but of the Jews. He says 50 of their most important outposts and 985 of their most famous villages were razed to the ground. 580,000 men were slain in the various raids and battles, and the number of those that perished by famine, disease, and fire was past finding out. He summarizes that nearly the whole of Judea was made desolate, but only that many Romans, moreover, perished in this war. So the many is what people expand into the loss of an entire legion. And so that, I don't think, is enough to convincingly argue that both the 9th and the 22nd legions were lost in those events. Generally speaking, when there's a lost legion, a legion destroyed, and its standard lost, we are told that it's lost. We've got the evidence of Varus, of course, and we've also got the evidence of the legions lost under Domitian. So we're told that the legions are lost. So I think that it's more likely that the legions are lost closer to when Marcus Aurelius raises 2 new ones, rather than waiting 40 years. Similarly, if you don't think that and that you want the legions to be lost, which one is it? Because we've got the list of legions, and when the 2 new legions are added by Marcus Aurelius, that's all the legions we have until 193. So if you've got another one lost, which one is it? And it doesn't work. So it's got to be, I think, one of the 2, the 9th or the 22nd, or both, indeed. So the culmination of all this is those other inscriptions which tell us, I think I've passed my 9-minute mark, sorry. The inscriptions that tell us that the 9th Legion existed beyond 119. So there's several commanders who had experience in the Legion that suggest that the Legion is still around in the 120s, even as late as 140. And so the idea that it's lost in 119 can't be sustained. You can push it to later in the 120s, but that can't really be sustained by someone who is the tribune of the 9th Legion in 140. Right. So Duncan Campbell examined the careers of these people in an article in Ancient Warfare 4.5, I think it was. Yes, indeed. So you've got Lucius Barbulius Liganius, the consul of 145, who was the Tribunus Laticlavius of 9 Hispana, sometime around 115. That one can fit with the normal narrative. Another, Lucius Aemilius Carus and Lucius Novius Crispinus Martialis Saturninus, who basically seem to have been involved in the legion in the 120s. Another is Lucius Annius Sextius Florentinus. But perhaps the clincher is Quintus Numisius Junior, who was consul in 161 AD and tribune of the 9th, probably 140. Otherwise, he waited 40 years to be consul. If you put his tribuneship in the early 120s of Hadrian, 40 years before he becomes consul, highly unlikely. And he only would have become consul at the age of 60, also highly unlikely. We've got roof tiles from Nijmegen found in 1959 with the stamp of the 9th Legion and a horse harness and a pendant, which have 9 Hisp. They're very tricky to date, but may date from the 120s. So all of that to say that there's an altar as well. Now, what you've got, therefore, is possible that the 9th Legion doesn't disappear the way that we've been told in Britain. It moves to Nijmegen, and from there is transferred to the east. That's entirely possible with all of the transfers of legions at this time. And that it is lost, not in Britain, not in the Jewish revolt, but in fact lost in 161 in Armenia by Severianus. It might also be the case that the 22nd Legion is also lost in Armenia in 161 and not in the Jewish revolt of the 130s. Therefore, my thinking is that the fate of the 9th and the fate of the 22nd is in fact that they are destroyed in Armenia in 161 at the outbreak of the Parthian War of Lucius Verus. Ooh, controversy. Join me again for another Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks.